Our ancestors worked hard, and there wasn't much to spare. So if they wanted new clothes, they made them. It was just that simple. And their handwork often became heirlooms, handed down from generation to generation. Maybe life is easier today, and maybe we are in a bigger hurry. But we can still take time to create heirlooms, and that is time worth spending.
Heirlooms by Design with Sharon LoMonaco is sponsored by Capital Imports, your passport for fine lace, embroideries, and fabrics, by OmniGrid, the most accurate and versatile products for the quilter, artist, and craftsperson, and by Quilts Plus, your authorized Bernina dealer. Now, here's Sharon.
Hi, I'm Sharon LoMonaco. Thanks for joining me on Heirlooms by Design. I have a special guest today, Hollis Turnbow from the Stencil Company. Thanks for joining us today, Hollis.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Sharon.
I hope you say that later on. I have a little bit of work for you to do.
This?
Today, Hollis is going to show us how to select stencils and how to mark our quilt tops and how to position the stencil so that we get an accurate marking. Just as soon as we return, we'll have some work for Hollis to do. Hollis, I always have a problem with finding a stencil the right size for the space. Can you give us some words of wisdom about this?
Well, I believe so. Since stencil is our business, unfortunately, it isn't possible to make a stencil or a quilting stencil to fit every exact size space. But it is easy, with just a few tips, which I will give you a little bit later on, to adjust any of those stencils to fit the space that you have. There's really no mystery to them, and buying commercially prepared stencils from any manufacturer for that matter is a very economical way to get a design for your quilt. All the quilting books, as you know, will have a suggested quilting design.
Sure.
But if you can imagine the amount of time that it would take to make that stencil, then to buy a commercially prepared stencil for $1.50 or $2.19 becomes a very economical process.
Certainly
so
does.
it really is a thing, and we're fortunate, or quilters are fortunate, there are literally thousands of these on the market.
It would also help with the accuracy. If you were to have to draw this out, it probably would be very difficult.
Certainly would be difficult. And the thing that intimidates most quilters is many quilters said, I'm not artistic, and I can't do that. I can't make that curve. So it does become a way to do it. And when I do a demonstration at a quilt show and show a few little techniques, they say, gee, that really takes the mystery out of it. So that's what I want to do today.
How do you determine the type of stencil that you're going to use for any particular location?
Well, stencils are prepared in basically three types. We have the block stencils, which go in that large area. We have stencils that are specifically prepared for the border areas in various sizes. Then there are background stencils for that all-over background quilting that we see in a quilt. It really needs no specific designs. So that's really the type that we're dealing with. There's some other specialized things, but these are primarily the 3 or 4 types that we're dealing with.
How are they sized?
Normally, what we will find is on the label on a stencil, there will be a number. For instance, this one says 08, which means that the design is 8 inches.
So we would use this with an 8-inch block or a larger?
Oh, no, it would have to be larger because really for an ideal appearance on your quilt, there should be at least 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch all the way around your quilting.
Certainly.
So in selecting an 8-inch stencil, that means it would probably fit best in a 9 or perhaps a 10-inch block. Same is true with the borders. Many quilters will come in and say, do you have a border that's a certain length? Well, it's certainly not practical to do that.
Certainly.
So borders are sized by the width. And again, this is a 3-inch width, which would fit in a 4-inch finished border. And then, of course, the adjustment is what is a mystery to many people, which I'll show how you indeed do that. Selecting the size, of course, as I said, depends entirely on the area that you wish to cover.
I'd like to just point out to all of you the differences between these two stencils. They're both designed to fit into the double wedding ring. However, you notice the smaller one will fit in a lot nicer than will the larger one.
On the other hand, if you put a very small one in the center, it certainly would be totally
It
lost.
gets lost, absolutely.
So you need to fill up the space so that it would be a pleasing balance. So
Right.
balance is really what we're dealing with here.
And we have a nice little space to fill with this one on the sign, on the melon.
That's a particular design type that is made, is that for the double wedding ring you need the center and then the melon section, and this enables you to use the design that's prepared, or perhaps just quilt a 1/4 inch out.
And this is a continuous line design, is that correct?
That is continuous, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because with the popularity of machine quilting, continuous line designs have become extremely popular. For instance, you can start on your machine, you can go here, here, here. It just continues around without stopping.
And they're not just restricted to machine quilting. You can also use the continuous line designs for your hand
For
quilting.
hand quilting, certainly, there is no restriction to that. So these are the types of designs that you might find, and it's important, I believe, that the correct type or style or design of the stencil be selected to fit the block that you're dealing with. Contemporary design for contemporary quilt,
Right.
etc.
We'll see how to mark a block with our stencil as soon as we return.
Sharon will be right back.
Hollis, show us how we're going to get the stencil design from the stencil onto the quilt and adjust it to the proper length.
Well, this is the segment that really takes all the mystery out of, or at least I hope it does.
Good.
I use a little trick that's very simple that helps me to adjust it. I like to tell quilters that it's really immaterial, the size of that particular area. And let's consider this strip here, the part that we're going to mark.
Okay.
I'm not concerned at all about whether or not that's 18 inches, 18 and a half, 19, 19 3/4, or whatever it is. What I use is adding machine paper, or you could use any kind of paper for that matter. And what I will do is I will cut the paper so that it will be exactly the size of this. Now, one thing that we should keep in mind is you have two sections to whatever of the border. You have a border section, and then there's a corner. Even though it might be squared, there is mitered, I should say, there is an invisible square there.
Certainly.
And you need to treat the turning of the corner a little bit different than what. So what I will do is to cut a piece of adding machine paper, freezer paper, whatever, the size of that, and then for my purposes, I'll fold down the mitered corner, because this particular quilt top has been mitered.
Right.
Now I know that this is the area that must be filled. This is the design that I've chosen, because this is a 3-inch strip width, and this is a 2-inch border.
Right.
What I will do now is to take this adding machine paper, fold it in half, and then fold it in quarter. So now, rather than being concerned about 54 inches, I'm
deal
only
with the small.
concerned about the 18 here, and make the adjustments accordingly. Now, I'm fortunate that I have two stencils exactly alike. Otherwise, I would do a bit of marking. I will lay the stencil down onto the paper, and the paper is only for adjustment purposes. Line the point up to the miter, because what I want to happen is these 2 points to touch right at that mitered corner.
I see.
I then lay it out, and because I do have two stencils here, I will lay the second one over and extend it.
Now, this comes a little bit beyond your mark,
Okay.
so how are we going to deal with
That's
that?
the adjustment that we need to make.
Okay.
What that has told me is that in this length of design, that quarter halfway or quarter point right there must either fall right here where this comes together, or in the very center. So I've got to extend this much so that the line will fall into the center.
So we just are going to scooch this down a
We're
little.
going to scooch it down, but not scooch it all at once. I'm going to make that slight adjustment, and let's move it back and just kind of give it a look. And that looks to me like it might be about a 1/2 inch.
That's right, I would
So
say.
in that length, we do a 1/2 inch. So I will go back here, and maybe in this one, I would scooch it 1/8 of an inch. When I mark to this point, I'll do an 1/8 of an inch here and here.
So these little adjustments are going to be not even visible on our
Not
final
even
marking.
visible, because as long as you're consistent here, your eye doesn't see it.
That's right.
And that's the important thing. But by working on paper first, then I know what that adjustment needs to be done. And you can do that and make that in any kind of border design.
So you would do this whether you're working with something this small or a larger
Or a
feather
larger,
type
better,
of design.
whatever.
even.
For instance, let's look at this border here. Very symmetrical. I would make an adjustment here and an adjustment here.
Right.
And even if that adjustment was every other one, it would still be okay because you're consistent throughout. But whereas if I made that 1/2 inch here, then your eye would immediately go to that point.
Certainly.
And corners are extremely important, because if this corner came up and ended out a 1/2 inch from that, and this one ended up in the corner,
It
then
just
your
wouldn't work.
eye goes there.
Sure.
The other thing that we need to be very conscious about are any of these border stencils that are directional. For instance, on our feather borders, they all go one direction.
We need to keep things going in the same direction.
That's right. We need at these key points to reverse that direction so that it will be consistent.
And we're going to see some more about placing our stencils as soon as we return.
Heirlooms by Design will return in a moment.
Hollis, tell us how we're going to determine the different stencils to use. I see we have a lot of different types down here in the border.
Well, what we have here, Sharon, is an excellent example of exactly what I've been talking about. The various elements, selecting stencils, selecting design, and a very important thing is the coordinating effect that stencils can have to your quilts. They have a latticed sampler here, which means that every block is different. Now we need to decide how we can pull that difference into a coordinated piece. The lattice in the quilt, of course, is the first element that does that. And that in itself starts unifying the total quilt. The second thing is that can do that extremely well is the selection of stencils. We're not working on a sampler of stencil designs or quilting designs in a quilt of this nature. First, let's look at the border. Now, I'm really kind of jumping ahead on this because it probably would be better to select the other design in here before we do the border. But let's talk about it at that point just so that our viewers will know what the options might be. And I've put several designs here. 3 of them are the background designs. It's certainly possible to use just a grid work out there. Just use a stencil or a yardstick to draw 3/4 or an inch. That in itself will not draw your attention to the border.
Right.
And this may be a situation in which we don't want to draw that attention. Might be a shell, it might be the pumpkin seed like this, or you may want to, based on the overall design, use something that's a little bit fancier.
The feather's
like
beautiful.
a feather like this. And if this was done here and we flip it over, then you have a nice unifying effect.
That would be lovely.
Or this stencil is certainly not wide enough for it, but this design may call for something more like that. So that's one of the options that you
Well,
have.
and we don't have to use it just the way it's drawn either.
No,
we
you
can,
don't.
We can change that around. We can make that be wider to
You
flow
can
the
indeed
whole
do
border.
that, because many times this could become a wider stencil
Sure.
if just lines were run on each side. Then it becomes only part of a larger thing. So that's one way to do it.
Okay.
Now let's put this side down so that our audience can see the entire quilt and then decide what we might do. I have chosen two or three stencils that will again show what has indeed been done. Here's a stencil that I created for a design called the Giant Dahlia. And you see the unifying effect because I've used the same motifs, the same feathers in each one. And when this is put in several places on the quilt, then that has a very unifying effect. As you mentioned earlier, we can take and pull elements out of stencils. For instance, here's a small triangular piece right here that you may want quilting into. Well, here's a design that was made for a double wedding ring, but here's a small 3-leaf that might be perfect right in that
Go right in
particular section.
each little triangle.
So what a quilter needs to do is to think of the economy of stencils and the number of elements within that design that you can indeed pull out. You may want to put the leaves here, pull over, and just do the
Do the
center
rows in the
rows
middle. That would be
there.
wonderful.
And that would make a nice coordinated effect there. But of course, the largest area in this quilt that we want to consider filling are these shapes right here.
That's right.
And again, it's a unifying effect that we're dealing with here. Here's a nice stencil. Looks nice in it. But what was the rule? What did we talk about? It
We
needs
need
to
to
fit
have,
the
it needs to
space.
fit the space, and
Needs to
that's
fit the
is too
space.
short.
Too short. However, this is just simply feathers, so why don't we put that there,
And
pull
move
it
up.
out, and move it
Make
out,
more feathers.
and extend that. There's nothing in any rule book that says you can't make
So
this
we're not
3
worried
yards long.
about purchasing a stencil to fit this
No,
exact little space.
no.
That's great.
Because it's the width that we're concerned about.
Okay.
Now, there might indeed be a design that didn't have a nice growing effect like this stencil would. But let's just pull that on out. See, and you have a unifying effect in there in the stencil.
And when we come back, are we going to get ready to mark my quilt?
Oh, we're going to do that. We're going to put some pencil marks on
Oh,
this
good. I can't
beautiful
wait.
white spaces.
We'll be back in just a moment.
We'll be right back.
Let's mark our quilt and tell us about our marking pens, or pencils rather.
The particular pencil or drawing device that a quilter selects becomes personal preference. You know, every quilt, if you talk to 12 quilters, each one will tell their particular favorite, and it's a pencil that they're particularly fond of. In fact, recently I had a woman come up at a booth at a quilt show and showed me a technique that her grandmother had used, and it was using a blunt needle that pressed a little bit ridge into the fabric, and it did a beautiful job. Some quilters will say a number 3 hard pencil. The one pencil, though, or marking device that I would caution are those that say they disappear in 3 hours, or
Right.
they will wipe off, because not so much a problem of that eating out the fabric, which I've heard that of, but the fact that if you do wipe off the blue or purple from the top, some of that will soak into your
Stays in.
batting and eventually will come out. Now, many quilters have said that they use it successfully by washing the quilt. The pencils that I particularly like are some that were originally made for the art industry, and it's called a multi-pastel chalk made by a company in New Jersey. And the thing that I like about this, it's soft chalk, but it has a little bit of stabilizer in it that keeps a good sharp point.
Oh, good.
And the important thing about it is it does erase out, and it washes out.
And you have a little fabric eraser here.
While the pencils do carry an eraser, I prefer any of the plastic erasers because that doesn't leave a residue or rubber residue on your fabric.
Okay.
But now let's put a mark on
Oh,
this.
good.
Is that
Let's
okay?
do it. Oh, yes, I'm dying to have
Okay,
this
we've
quilt
already
marked.
talked about this design as the possibility. But as I look at it, that really, to me, does not coordinate with the rest of the block.
So what are we going to do?
Well, I found this one in my stash, and it seemed to have many of the elements. It has the same shapes in this as we find in the quilt, and I think that is important. So
Okay.
let's lay on it and see what happens.
Oh, could it be perfect?
Something must be wrong.
It's exactly perfect.
Exactly perfect. You know, Well, those things do happen.
So now we're
folks,
just going
you
to
know.
take the pencil and
Yes.
we can just
Wait just a minute.
Oh.
Place it and make sure that you don't
want it even.
let it move. Now again, let me mention this. If it needed to have a little bit of length added, where would we add it in this one?
In the middle
In the middle of each of these.
of the melon. And
Okay?
then, now are we ready to
And in
mark?
that case, you would mark down to that point.
Mm-hmm.
She wants to get onto this.
I
again.
know, I want some marks on
Yes.
here. Can we go the other way too?
You can go the other way too.
Halfway.
Halfway. I'm using the light gray, you're using the dark gray.
And we're still going to mark just a half here
Yes.
in case we need to do any adjusting.
Yes.
I just can't
Isn't
wait to
this
get
fun?
this
I tell you.
quilt started quilting.
This is just like
And we can just
kid-
continue because we know that it's the correct size.
This is just like kids at kindergarten with Play-Doh, isn't it? I tell you.
You know, Hollis, I'll bet you could have my quilt marked before you leave.
Well, I'm not sure about that. There it is.
So, Hollis, what are we going to do with these gaps that we have in our stencil?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Sharon, because I have a lot of quilters, especially a beginning quilter, ask that very question because they see the gaps in the stencil and say, do I quilt through that or do I skip that? And it's interesting the number of quilts that we see in quilt shows that the quilter did not. These are called stays, and they're simply put into the stencil to keep it from falling apart.
Sure.
What you do is, if the quilter is unsure, then I would suggest going back and lightly trace in at that point. If not, you can just eye it as you needle it through. But that needs to be completed so that your design will be complete.
Certainly.
And then,
Now, Hollis, you're going to have time to finish marking my quilt before you leave, aren't you?
well, I'm not sure. We probably will have to make an appointment for that.
Well, I'll call Peggy, and
Okay.
it'll be all right. We'll be right back with Hollis Turnbow and some finishing touches. Hollis, do you have any final words of wisdom for us about picking stencils?
Well, I think so, Sharon. We've talked about size, selecting the designs. We've even marked a little bit.
A little bit.
Yes, and you better have that finished by the time I come back down here again.
Well, maybe I'll have it marked.
But the thing I'd like to say to the quilters is that stencils or quilting designs are not sacred. They're there to be modified, to be changed, to stretch, to pulled in, to do whatever needs to be done to fill the space that you have. And I brought a couple or three things here just simply to give that example. Had a quilter one time who bought this stencil, or rather she brought a quilt in very much like yours and said, what can we do here? And she particularly liked this design. And so we started playing with it, started looking with it, and she agreed that it does make a nice border design if you put them together. But also if you look, it has other motifs. We changed
heart.
it and added, here's a heart, here's a larger heart if we do it this way. And there were several large spaces in the quilt that we could just simply keep manipulating this design, and it gave a wonderful unifying effect throughout it. This design I found in an antique market, and it was interesting because there were actually two cardboard stencils cut out, but they were clipped together like this.
Oh, how nice.
And so here's a stencil that just by adjusting it a little bit, you can create an entirely new design depending on what it is. And then of course this is my very favorite design as something that's really versatile. If you leave these off, you have a wonderful border design.
Oh, yes.
If you leave all of this off, you have a small design, or you can adjust it around and you have even another one.
I've used this by doing it cut across here
Cut
into
across
a
here
triangle.
as a triangle, which is one of those very difficult places. So change, mutilate the design to fit the space that you have in your quilt so that your quilt becomes truly yours.
That's great. You have really inspired me to get these quilts marked and get them finished.
Thank you.
And I hope he's inspired all of you as well. I've really enjoyed visiting with you today. I hope you'll continue to tune in to Heirlooms by Design. In the coming weeks, we have some delightful guests as well as new toys and gadgets to make your sewing easier and faster. We will be showing you techniques ranging from quilting to French machine sewing, machine embroidery to lace making, and all of them will be Heirlooms by Design.
Heirlooms by Design has been brought to you by Capital Imports. by Omnigrid, and by Quilts Plus. If you'd like more information on the supplies and techniques used in today's show, then drop us a note to Quilts Plus, 1211 Noble Street, Anniston, Alabama 36201. That's Quilts Plus, 1211 Noble Street, Anniston, Alabama 36201. Sharon will be back with more Heirlooms by Design next week.